Maximize cloud efficiency with Doit, the trusted partner in multi-cloud management for thousands of companies worldwide. Visit doit.com. That's DOIT.com. Do it, your cloud simplified.
Packet pushers.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. I'm Jennifer JJ Manila, here with Drew Conry-Murray, and today we have some really interesting stuff. I say that every week, but it is. I think Drew and I really go out and dig up and find and root out all of the cool stuff happening, and we try to bring it here to you. So we have this week Eyvonne Sharp, who's the head of North American Customer Engineering Infrastructure Modernization at Google Cloud. That's a mouthful. So Eyvonne's been in this role for a couple of years and a few years at Google in other roles, but has a long history of highly, technical roles in network security and architecture for about the past 20 years. But she's talking to us today about tips for individual contributors and sort of developing and moving towards leadership skills and what it means about building relationships, getting invited to the table and having those kind of conversations, communicating and prioritizing security and risk, and some tips about informal leadership. We asked her about leading through influence. She's put out several great, blog posts and resources. And just ultimately, I think the takeaway was about enabling others. And I think she said something to the effect of becoming a student of people and learning about people in addition to technology. And so this is a fantastic conversation. We're going to drop right in. And Drew and I want to invite you guys and gals, if there's anybody out there working on this. So if you're pursuing, non-technical skills as part of your professional development, we'd love to hear from you too at packetpushers.net/FU or find us anywhere else on the internet. So let's get started with Eyvonne.
Well, Eyvonne, welcome. You wrote a piece on the language of business outcomes, and we often hear that technical people should learn to speak in the ways that make sense to the business side of the organization. Your post couches this idea around business outcomes, and I like that phrasing. So why should security or technical people in general communicate in business outcomes? What's the value to an IT person speaking this kind of language?
Well, anytime we have a project or an initiative that we want to get across that requires funding, typically we have to earn the trust and frankly, the funding from folks in the business. And so we have to be able to explain to them why what we think is important in a way that they'll understand it. So it's really about communicating well, understanding what the business values, what's important, what initiatives they're trying to get off the ground, and then how to speak in a way that just makes sense and demonstrates that what you're trying to accomplish aligns with what the larger business tries to accomplish.
I love this because I think one of the traps we fall into as, technologists is we get so into whatever it is we are doing and thinking about and working on and whatever, like training we just had or thing that we just learned. And we're so focused on that strategy that we lose sight of really our role in the bigger ecosystem of business and who's supposed to be making decisions and how we're supposed to be supporting that. And I feel like there's so many other side takeaways from just that one blog post that you wrote here.
One of the things that happens in technology too is phrases come and they go. I thought about using the word fad, but I don't think that's really the right word. But for example, we'll want to talk about zero trust architectures. Mm-hmm. And as a philosophy and a concept, zero trust is important and it's valuable and it's meaningful. But if you go to your business decision maker and just say, hey, I want to get this latest zero trust thing from vendor X because it's going to make us more secure, they don't necessarily understand what that means or what that's going to do for the business. And so you're much better off if you can explain in terms that make sense, and you can use compliance requirements or just compliance rules that the entire organization has to be aware of. And I think one of the great tools to do that is if your company's publicly traded, you can listen to earnings calls, you can read the 10Ks that your company releases, and anything that's important enough to be discussed on an earnings call or is reported in a 10K, that's something that's going to resonate when you start talking to leaders about technology that you want to implement. So anytime you can talk in those terms, it's going to get you further with business leaders.
So you're saying in some ways there's an impetus for the technical side of the house to do a little bit of study and prep to figure out what's important to the business aside from just keep the network up and running, make sure we don't get hacked and earn money.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we can get so focused in our technology world that we think that the implications of what we want to do are really clear. Like if we want to implement, for example, a new approach to patching throughout the organization that's going to require a certain degree of commitment in man hours or in systems or organizational structure changes, we know how those are going to improve our day-to-day operations. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the business leader you're talking to knows what that means and knows why it matters for them. Because the sad reality is that just because something saves an operational team time, it doesn't quantify what that time means to the business. It's not necessarily a meaningful argument because that operational time is already bucketed in a budget. It's accounted for. And unless you can say, hey, we're going to deliver this much value out of those time savings, it's not going to be as impactful.
I have a question because looking through your blog post and just really your resume and everything on LinkedIn, and you've done some really awesome stuff. And it looks like you've managed teams and maybe manage a team currently. How do you approach this conversation with your team members as you're kind of bringing people into this mindset?
Yeah, I think it's just important to have the conversation and talk through what's the talk track that you're thinking about here and what's your approach, and then to present ideas. I think I'm in the fortunate position of working with folks who are quite senior. And so many of them already have this muscle memory, but I've certainly been on teams where I have to step back and say, now, wait a minute. And in my case, often it's what do we hear from the customer about what their goals are? Or if you were in an organization working in their IT department, what did we hear on our latest all hands call? What are we hearing from our leaders? And how do we effectively speak to what they're concerned about? And I think a lot of it just comes through conversation. You can build and provide a high level view of what the organization cares about. So I think that's important also for leaders to say, hey, these are our big 3 priorities right now organizationally, and not just as it relates to how our team functions, but what's the goal of the larger business and how can we help with that?
In organizations where maybe there's not the clarity, and maybe there is clarity at the top, but there's not clarity in the middle between, those of us that are fingers on keyboard and feet on the street, and that those layers kind of right above that. What's sort of your guidance for finding that clarity, whether you're down at the bottom or kind of in the middle of that mix? And then what are some maybe examples or some key ways or processes or exercises to go through to find ways that the technical tasks are mapped directly to those business outcomes?
We've all dealt with the challenge of a lack of clarity in our organization, or decisions get made and we don't understand why they're made, or that there's a certain level of detail that just can't be shared. For me, the way I've always attempted to solve those problems is in the, arena of personal relationships. Get to know people across your organization, whether they're in your security team or in your infrastructure team or your networking team, or if you've worked with somebody in the past in a particular line of business, keep those lines of communication open, because often as you talk to different people in different parts of the org and understand their goals and objectives, it can help you triangulate what the larger story is, even if it hasn't been clearly and crisply communicated. And so I think for me, it's the relational piece of staying in touch with folks no matter where they are, what they do, and to continue to use those personal relationships to learn and to grow, and also to help you in your role have empathy for what those other folks are experiencing. Because it can be really powerful to go to a leader and say, hey, I was talking to Sally over in the line of business, and they're having real challenges with this direct revenue impacting task. And my background's often in healthcare. So to be able to say, hey, we realize that the nurses are spending 30 extra minutes a day, or this agent on their workstation is slowing them down, or, the last time that we did patching, the timing really caused a problem for them, and we want to improve that, which will get us this many more clinical hours on the floor, for example. And those kinds of arguments are going to be way more powerful than just saying our patching is broken and we need to fix it, as an example.
Yeah, and there's so many examples like that. I remember just recently a conversation with a client who has a lot of operational technology, OTICS stuff. And it's just that communication gap of, there's security policies around having to scan any type of anything coming into the environment, right? Like removable media, patching update stuff. But the kiosk that was set up to do that in this particular example would take literally overnight or longer to scan a single drive because of how the scanning was happening and what was on these drives. And so it just made it just a completely impossible, task. And then, the fallout of delays that are a whole day or 2 days because you couldn't scan a USB drive on a security kiosk is just, understanding what we're doing in the context of how other people have to use that definitely, I think, impacts the bottom line.
For sure.
Can you give some examples maybe of technical outcomes that might matter to the business and how to talk about them in ways that make sense to business people?
Most of these are framed in terms likely of revenue. They will say the business will have a target that we want to increase a certain revenue for a certain line of business, or they will say we want to be the primary solutions provider for this particular offering in our area of expertise. And I think the examples related to that are if you have quantifiable downtimes in the past, for example, as relate for security incidents that have impacted the business. And you can say in a way that's demonstrable and is not FUD that, we believe we can improve uptime by X, which translates to this much in revenue. I think that's the key. Like, how do you tie it back to dollars? Because that's ultimately what either dollars or the mission of the organization, even if it's a nonprofit organization, healthcare is a great example here. Again, you have lots of nonprofit healthcare orgs that are not as worried about growing in revenue as they are in number of patients that they see, or their ability to open new clinics or provide additional service in the area. All of those things are business outcomes that we can tie the technology to.
I get that, but I also feel like particularly security, that's challenging because unlike, say, the application development team where they're going to be like, we wrote this new app and it generated X revenue, or we rolled out X number of new features this quarter and it was more than last quarter. Security is in some ways about making sure things don't happen. So how do we tie that into money or to revenue or to goals?
Again, we have to walk a careful line and understand the temperature of our business leaders and what makes sense to them. So I think there's a personal component there. I think I would always advise to be super careful about piling on a major global outage, like what happened with CrowdStrike recently. You've got to be careful, but also you do have to find ways to talk about risk that are real and use the tools and the data that you have. If you've had a recent compliance audit where there were challenges, or you've never had a challenge on a compliance audit, to say, this is the approach that we've taken in the past. It's resulted in these outcomes and we want to continue with those. And those things are incredibly important to the business. But even in security, I think it's the challenge of drawing those straight lines that are sometimes pretty difficult. And I think it's super important for the organization to believe that you're in the boat with them. You're not there to object unnecessarily. You're not there to be a hindrance to projects. And some of that is going to dovetail into how we operationally do the job day to day. Are we getting aligned with projects early in the process so that we're not the last stop on the approval wagon is security? And then once security signs off, we're ready to go, right? That's a horrible place to be. And if you are always there, then you're always going to be fighting an uphill battle because people have already done all the work. And so then all of a sudden you're just the party of no. And so for me, some of it is also about how you build that trust as a security organization in your day-to-day operations, which is going to give credibility to you when you go to your leaders and say, hey, these are things that we think are really important.
So maybe this ties into what you said earlier about cultivating relationships and even empathy, in part by getting to know people getting to know business requirements, business objectives, and then being at those meetings, being at those planning sessions so you can start having the conversation with them about managing risk sooner, as opposed to a project's almost fully developed. And then they come to you and you look it over and you're like, oh my God, there are 3 things we cannot do here.
Right. And I think it's important also to understand the risk profile of your organization, right? Some organizations can tolerate more risk than others and have different compliance requirements. And there's different things at stake depending on what not only your organization does, but really what the potential breach is or the potential thing that you're protecting from. And I think that's also important, understanding what's the risk tolerance and how to speak to that.
You also mentioned try to avoid FUD, and I think our industry, at least on the vendor marketing side, sort of FUD is the default position, and so maybe security professionals sort of get used to thinking in that way. Are there terms or ideas that would sort of trigger you being like, yeah, that's a little fuddy, we shouldn't go there when we're talking to the business?
Again, it's going to depend on the people and personalities involved. But I do think like the CrowdStrike incident is an interesting one because it was so catastrophic. And even though that in and of itself wasn't an actual security failure, it was a failure of a vendor. But if we catastrophize everything that we talk about, then we just lose credibility. I think also you have to understand what have been the business implications of these kinds of failures in the past. One of the challenges that I see is we talk a lot about reputational damage. And it sounds good to warn about reputational damage, but I would be careful with that because we've seen organization after organization after organization in the headlines, and there's been a breach, and there has been a temporary blip, but all in all, they continue to function.
Yeah.
So are there things that you can talk about that are more tangible than reputational damage? Of course, nobody wants their names in the headlines for a breach. Of course, we don't want that. But I also think an argument could be made. That's what insurance is for. It's not going to stop the business. It happens so much that people are almost immune to it. And although those things really hurt the souls of those of us who see our primary career objective to guard the security and data and privacy of our organization and its users, those are real things that get talked about in the marketplace and aren't as uncomfortable for people outside of our line of work. So I think we just have to be careful with terms like that and try to be as tangible as we can be.
So one of the things that I latched onto that you have reiterated a couple of times is about building relationships and having and entering into that conversation early. And I think my question for you is, what advice do you have for listeners who are in a more technical position, who are interested in having some of these conversations and these relationships, but they feel like they're either, not invited or not educated or not empowered, either with information or access to the types of people who are making these decisions? Are there things that they could do, even if they're kind of being, smushed down the org chart, if you would?
Yeah. So I think it can happen in stages. I think most projects, as I've seen them in the last, really 5 to 10 years, are almost always cross-functional. You're almost always working with another team or a virtual team of people that don't all have the same reporting structure, and with that in IT, you might have a security person and a networking person and an infra person. Or if you're working on rolling out a new application, you're going to have constituents from the line of business. And what I would say is start with those relationships of people that you're working with in other projects. Get to know them. Something that I do very frequently is if there's somebody I just want to connect with, I think they're interesting, and I think that there might be something I can learn, is I will try to schedule a monthly one-on-one on their calendar. Hey, once a month, can we just get on the phone for 30 minutes and, update one another of what's going on in our worlds? I'd love to know more about the challenges you're facing and how we could help you with those. I think that is very helpful, especially if you're a remote worker, then to do that virtually. If you're in the same physical space, people enjoy coffee or a snack or a lunch, and those time-honored tools are still available to us. And I think often we just have to for those of us who are introverts, push through some of that introversion and talk to people. There's just no replacement for that. And so just a combination of getting to know people that you're working with, connecting across those groups, and finding a mechanism to do that, whether it's virtual, whether it's in person. And as you do that, you will get more opportunities to speak more broadly across your organization.
Do you think access to people virtually and everything that happened through the pandemic has helped people connect more because you don't have to be co-located with them? Or do you think that's been a little bit of a hurdle that people are navigating?
You know, we're hearing a lot about the push to return to office. And some of that is because there is something that happens when people are in the same physical space and are able to have the back and forth and work together. And so I do think in that respect, we've lost something. And I think it's only fair to acknowledge that. But I also think it's given us a new mechanism to reach out to people. And whereas, somebody in an office on the other end of the country, we'd have been less likely, 5 years ago to reach out and say, hey, can I get 15 minutes on your calendar once a month so that we can connect? That would have seemed kind of strange. It's less strange now because there's less distance in that sense from us and the person in an office far away. So there are positives and negatives, and we can try to use as many of the positives as we can.
I mean, I know people in my own life who are more comfortable having quasi face-to-face engagement when it's mediated via a Zoom call or some other kind of screen. It just takes some pressure off them, I think. So if you're looking for ways to kind of like get yourself in the mindset of, okay, I need to start working on the social side of my security or IT career, maybe that's one of the ways to kind of let yourself get into it. It doesn't always have to be right in somebody's face, literally. It can be mediated through Zoom or some other screen.
Sure. And I think one of the things that the remote opportunity gives us is the ability to say, hey, let's put this recurring thing on our calendar, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then that takes away the mental load that we have trying to keep this Rolodex of people that we want to keep in touch with. Like we just have a, monthly 15 minute that's going to pop up on our calendar. And I'm all about any tools or systems that I can use to try and reduce some of that mental load. And I found that to be incredibly helpful.
Business initiatives tend to incorporate some element of risk, and security objectives are often to mitigate that risk. And so it feels like there's sort of like divergent impulses there. Is there a way to kind of harmonize them or align them better?
Let's take a quick sponsor break. Maximize cloud efficiency with Doit, the trusted partner in multi-cloud management for thousands of companies worldwide. Doit's innovative tools, expert insights, and smart technology make optimization simple. Elevate your cloud strategy and simplify your cloud spend. Visit doit.com. That's DOIT.com. Doit, your cloud simplified. And now back to the show.
I think one of the challenges that happens with security professionals is they are trying to get to this no risk state. And I think we have to come to terms with the fact that that does not exist. If we want zero risk, we will unplug all the systems and shut them down and not connect them to the internet. And that's not very conducive to the business. So I do think we have to accept that there's a certain degree of risk. I also think that there is a lot we can do in our organizations with not just well-oiled policy, but also clear procedures and operational practices that don't require a lot of vendor investment. Now, they require a lot of time and energy and focus. And I think it's important to do those things well. And I think so often we find that breaches happen because those basics have not been tended, either patching or multi-factor or some of those very straightforward things. And it's a failure of a combination of not so much technology, but either improperly misapplied or not applied technology. So I think that's one thing that we can do to manage the risk. But also, as we're thinking about risk, we can't just think about stopping all the bad things. We also have to think about opportunity cost, right? And if we don't do Project X, what do we stand to lose as an organization? And then how can we help enable that in a way that is more secure, or do it in a way that's going to help us meet our requirements, but accept less risk. And then I think if we carefully and clearly communicate risk, and then business leaders decide that the risk is worth it, that's their prerogative, because they ultimately have the responsibility for the business. And I think sometimes we have to realize where ultimate accountability for those decisions are and just be sure that we're really clear on them, because sometimes you have to accept a certain degree of risk to move forward in life and in business.
That's a huge one to me, and it strikes home. I think I lead in every technical training when we talk about, security concepts, with underscoring the fact that it's our job to understand the technical risk and hopefully to communicate those. It's somebody else's job to make the determination of what level of risk is going to be accepted and how our time and resources should be spent. And I think that's the hard pill for a lot of us to swallow, because we feel like we were brought in to be the experts, and sometimes we don't see the big picture of, sometimes there is a bigger dragon, or sometimes, especially in an organization, your size, where a risk is accepted and the consequence of that risk has a dollar number associated to it, which is lower than the cost to mitigate whatever that risk or that vulnerability is, in which case it's just accepted at that.
One of the phrases that I've used a lot, especially as my children are now adults, is I relinquish my imagined right to control other people. Now, that's not necessarily an IT phrase, but it is something I tell myself often, right? That sometimes I believe I have control in a situation where I don't. And so my job is to do the best I can do to represent the current state, the risks as I see them, what I believe the costs are. And here's the thing, we often don't want to admit to our leadership areas of weakness that we need to shore up to be able to go to a leader. And again, this requires some healthy relationship and psychological safety on both sides, but to have a relationship where you can go to a leader and say, hey, we have historically made the decision or have not had the resources to, or we're unaware of this particular area of risk. We are now aware of it. And because of X, Y, and Z, we believe we need to make an investment in that area. And some of that means being vulnerable enough to say, hey, this is an area where we're weak today and we have exposure here, right? That doesn't mean that you've been a failure. It means that either you've prioritized other things, didn't have the resources, the landscape has changed. So there's a new emerging threat that was previously unseen. And there's nothing wrong with saying those things plainly and clearly and not thinking that that is somehow a reflection on you or your ability to do your job. I think often some of the biggest mistakes and breaches and failures that we've seen have been when we haven't been honest with ourselves or leaders about the risk. And so we've tried to fix it by shoving it in with another project, right? We'll go get this project approved. And while we do that project, we'll remediate this other thing. Well, if the folks approving the budget don't realize that those things are tethered together and don't even realize that there's a risk there, they can't make an effective decision.
Yeah.
And it's when we are not clear about the risks and the challenges in the current state, that's where negative accountability happens for technical leaders, I believe, and rightly so.
Speaking of leaders, Drew, I think you shared another blog post from Eyvonne on leading through influence.
Yeah, I think this is probably a good place to switch the conversation a little bit, because you did write, Eyvonne, another post on leadership through influence, and that is being able to get things done even if you don't have a title. And I really like that idea because I feel like it provides a mechanism for people to develop leadership capabilities without sort of waiting around for that authority that's sort of bestowed on people when they get a title. And just to kind of kick off this conversation, how do you think about, formal and informal leadership? What's the difference?
Yeah, so for me, leadership is really about influence. And one of the healthy thought exercises I learned a long time ago was imagine that you're running a 100% volunteer organization that's a nonprofit, and you have no ability to motivate people with dollars. They're all volunteers. How are you going to behave to get all of those folks on board? And I think that's a helpful thought exercise to think through, okay, I can't promise them a bonus. I can't raise their pay. But there are tools that you have in your tool bag. So when we're talking about informal leadership, we're talking about marshaling people in a way similar to that. And so you have to talk a lot about what you're trying to accomplish, what the goals are, about creating an environment where people feel like they can make a contribution, about valuing folks' feedback, listening, and then, being really clear on decisions when they are made. And really, all of those things I just described are the same things leaders in formal leadership roles should also do. The things in formal leadership roles that you have is you have a certain degree of authority just because of your positional role. You have control and influence over salaries, on bonus, on people's employment, and all of those are tools. But I think ultimately, if you lean on those tools too much, then you're not actually leading well. And that's why I talk about that thought exercise is what would it mean to marshal this group of people if they were all volunteers? And how would we move them forward?
I would kind of maybe break that down in my own head that sort of the positional leadership tools, if you only use those, like your salary, even having a job or giving you a bad, annual report, those are coercive. Whereas what you're talking about with informal leadership or even good formal leadership is more persuasive.
Yeah. And also the thing to consider too is if you're in a position as an individual contributor and you've taken on kind of a tech lead role or an architect role, you don't have any direct reports. It's also important to remember that once you're in a formal leadership role inside of an organization, there's a ton of just administrative and organizational overhead that comes along with that.
Yeah, there is.
A lot of times I see folks who want the authority and feel like it will help them get more done if they were in a formal leadership role, become sadly disappointed because actually they're able to accomplish less of the work that they really loved because of all of the administrative overhead. So it's just important to know the difference between the roles. And as you're thinking about where you want to land in your organization, what it is that you really love and want to do. But I have found I'm in a formal leadership role now, but I spent years as an informal individual contributor leader and found that work really rewarding and fulfilling.
I have to ask. So, I mean, just looking back over everything you've done is a lot of, consulting network engineer, network architect, solutions engineer. Like you've been a very technical professional for a very long time and now, leading some large groups at Google. And I'm curious, like what progression you followed and how you ended up kind of on this path that got to one of the blog posts I landed on your website, which was just what you mentioned about that Venn diagram of the work you're good at and the work you love and finding yourself and what you want to do and untangling that. What was your journey like?
As technologists early in our career, we so closely align our identity with our craft, with what we know, with learning more, with being the go-to person around a certain topic. And that can be very rewarding and very fulfilling. And for some people, they're always rewarded and fulfilled doing that work. And I think that's great. We need those folks. I think the thing that I found over the course of my career is that the technical problems became less interesting to me and the people and organizational problems became more interesting. And so I always primarily saw myself as a problem solver. And so now it's just the nature of the problem has changed. And so I'm thinking more about what people and what skills do I need to be sure we're meeting the need of the business? I'm thinking about what do I need to do in my organization to provide the right level of not just clarity, but air cover for my folks to go do their best work, right? And so I'm not so much thinking about Eyvonne and what's the next thing that I want to do, but it's how do I take this group of people and be sure that as much as possible, they're all performing at the highest level of their ability. That is a real problem and it is a hard problem and it requires expertise to solve. It's just a different kind of problem. And so for me, that's how I've framed it in my head and that's how it makes sense to me.
I love everything that you say. I wish I could like poke and pick into things and argue with you about something, but I'm just like, I absolutely adore this mindset because I think it is the base of so many problems that we have. And I have so many friends and professional colleagues who I don't think that people always leave a job because of the manager, but I do think that in everything you've just described in these technical roles, we have people that end up in a management position and they can't let go of the technical stuff. And so what they end up doing is second guessing their team, hiring smart people, but then micromanaging them, or, you brought the expert in that you hired, right? And then you're just going to ignore what they've told you to do and do this other thing that you're used to. And it's demoralizing. And I don't think they understand that they're doing it. And I love just shining a light on this because I think for a lot of us, like it's a mirror to hold up and make sure we're not doing that. And we're not holding ourselves back. And we're not holding all of the people around us and under us back if you're in a position of management.
I think there's this mindset often that people believe being a leader is really just about being the best individual contributor. Like it's almost like an IC plus role. Like I'm going to keep doing the things I've always done. I'm just also going to help all these people around me do it better like me. And there are different philosophies. I've heard people talk a lot about player coach. I have thoughts there too. I'm probably not going to go into all that today, but I think you have to make a fundamental shift in your thinking from, am I here to be sure I'm giving my best work? Or do I want to be here to be sure everybody else is giving their best work? Because if I can enable 10 direct reports that I have to all be better, I'm going to scale way better than if I just make myself better, right? And that's, I think, the thing that often gets missed.
So out of all of, I'm going to ask you a certification question, professional development question. Let me make it broad as we're kind of hitting the end here. Probably all of our listeners have their CCNA, CCIE, C whatever, Q this, expert that. What are some recommendations you've had for people if it's an individual contributor that's looking to kind of flex these muscles or develop these skills outside of a technical competency, aside from the blog posts and resources like that, because you've got some awesome stuff there. What are some good things for them to go explore?
Look for opportunities to lead a larger informal team. I did a lot of that in my transition. So it was more how do I pull this group of people together, try and be sure that we're clear on the objectives, that everybody knows where they're going and what we're trying to accomplish, and then to try and fit the right people into the right role. I think there's opportunities to do that as an IC. And so you can talk to your manager and say, hey, I'd really like to start taking on some more leadership. I think a team lead role can be really helpful in that, especially if your primary focus is how do I develop the people around me?
I assume if you're not in a position within your organization for one reason or another to make that happen, you can take this outside of your work life into some community volunteer, anything, your church, your study group, your woodworking, your beak, whatever you do, right?
Well, and especially for folks who are developers. I mean, there are open source projects in desperate need of organization and leadership. And I think the ones that have been most successful have been those that have had leaders. And most of those leaders have also been deeply technical, but they've also been able to enable and organize people to be effective. So I think, if you're a developer and have that skill set, open source is the way to do that. And I think also just becoming a student of people along with technology. For me, that involves a lot of reading, but it is also just trying to understand what's underneath people's choices and behavior and really what motivates them, because we have to do that by listening. It's a dangerous game to go, well, I think they did that because of XYZ. Like, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, conversations with people and then reading and understanding organizational psychology, Kahneman and Tversky, anything by them, Adam Grant, Brene Brown, a lot of Simon Sinek are all some writers, I think, who talk about this arena. And if you start reading about that and you're like, ugh, these topics just exhaust me, then maybe people leadership's not for you. And that's okay.
Uh-huh. I don't know if it's the wrong context, but in some ways, if it makes people contextualize this more, in some ways it's like social engineering. And I'm not talking about trying to deceive or manipulate people, but trying to understand and persuade people.
Use your powers for good.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. And especially highly skilled people that are in what we'll call the second half of their career, they are not cookie cutters. They are not motivated by the same things. They work differently. They're going to have different goals for work-life balance. They're going to have different skills and tasks that really charge their batteries, and other skills and tasks that are depleting for them. And so part of being a leader is, within reason, being able to see and recognize those things and then align those people so that they all work well together. And if that is an interesting problem for you, we need all the great people leaders we can find. And if you can think in those problem-solving terms, I think it's helpful, especially for technologists. But Drew, you're right. The social engineering analogy is a good one, because absolutely, you're listening, you're trying to understand, you're trying to think, how do I communicate these objectives in a way that's going to be meaningful to these people? And it's not manipulative. If it's done well, it's done for the good of that individual, their career, and the business. And to me, that's the challenge, is how do I create a scenario in as much as possible as that everybody wins?
Yeah, it feels like what I'm taking away from this is that a lot of leadership is not about I, but it's about we.
There's no I in team. We could find all of the
all the cliches, line them up.
That's right.
And Eyvonne, one of the ideas you wrote about is modeling execution. What does that mean?
Really, it means, how am I going to model what right looks like? And I think in order to execute well, there are certain things folks have to do. You have to study and develop expertise. That's incredibly important, because ultimately your personal expertise is the foundation on which everything else is built. But also you can look around and find those who model who you think you want to be, or they are in a role that looks interesting to you. So what are the things that they do? Maybe even if you don't fully understand them, if you're in a position to have a conversation about that. Hey, I saw you did this thing and I don't really understand it. What was that about? And they may be like, that's just a habit of mine. Or they might be like, several years ago, I learned that if I approach it this way, and those tools can be incredibly helpful. And then the next part of that is, as you learn, you don't have to understand the whole picture to begin to teach somebody else. So develop the skills and mechanisms to relay what you're learning to other people. And a pattern that I've seen work very well is a person with expertise leads and then has a learner shadow them. And then they'll enter into a process where the learner reverse shadows. In other words, the learner takes the lead, but then the expert is there to help with questions that may arise or give them a sense of comfort. And then after you do that a couple times, then the apprentice is ready to take out on their own. And I think this is a helpful model, whether we're wanting to lead or whether we're wanting to grow in our skills. And some organizations formalize this process, but it's something that you can certainly do either within your own team or with a peer you agree with. And I think it's incredibly powerful. And I think we have to prevent ourselves from hoarding knowledge, because we so often identify with our skill set. We can hoard knowledge. And ultimately, that does a couple things. First of all, it makes you the only one who can answer the question, which is not good for your long-term physical and emotional health.
Right. Self-inflicted when you hoard the information and then you play the martyr because you can never go 48 hours without somebody texting you at 2:00 in the morning. Yeah.
Right. And especially as we're talking about leadership, if you ever want to be something other than the role that you're in, you have to help somebody come up along behind you and fill that role. Right. So I think those are important things to keep in mind. Like, it just never works well when we hoard what we know. And I think some of that is having the confidence that we're good enough to share the information that we have. And I think that is one of the biggest enablers that we can have for ourselves and our organizations.
Heck yeah. I saw modeling execution. I had to ask because, Drew knows me and songs go through my head. So I had like combinations of Blue Steel and Right Said Fred, do my little turn on the catwalk, on the catwalk. Yeah. Sorry. I had to get Drew to roll his eyes at me at least one time during the episode. And there it is right at the end.
Not models on a catwalk. Yeah. No.
Yeah, I can see how you got there, but
Yep.
yeah.
Would never have gotten there myself. How's that?
JJ always surprises and delights.
Yeah, it's usually best not to follow my brain into the rabbit holes.
You're also dating yourself with the Right Said Fred reference.
I know. We watched still on MTV. Hey, you were there with me. That's how
I
you knew what
was.
I was talking about.
Uh-huh.
Right there with you. Gen X for the win on this one.
Eyvonne, this is so much great information. I think there's so many awesome takeaways. I even took a bunch of notes myself. Again, I just, spirit animal here. I love everything and being able to have a model. And, for those people that are minorities, but also just people that are individual contributors who are looking to develop those skills and do more and have a bigger impact ultimately than where they feel like they have their sphere of influence right now.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Where are you on the internet if folks want to, see what you're up to and get more of your writing and thoughts?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. So just Eyvonne Sharp on LinkedIn. I have the blog, esharp.net. I'm also co-hosting the Cloud Gambit with William Collins. So you can find us at thecloudgambit.com. And every now and then I show up on the hedge with Russ White and share my thoughts on the roundtable. So there's all kinds of places to see me. Oh, and don't forget Twitter. I can't call it anything else. You can find me there at Sharp Network.
Awesome. We'll have all those links in the show notes, and we'll have the links to the blogs that we use as our jumping off point for this conversation.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure, Eyvonne. All right, pivoting now to some quick news before we wrap. First, the Washington Post is reporting that scammers are able to hijack the listings of phone numbers in Google search results so the people end up talking to scammers rather than the business they searched for.
Yes. As it turns out, there are numerous ways to bypass some of Google's verification. I mean, really, come on. We can pick on Google. We can pick on any one of the tech companies for various reasons. But I think any of us would have issues sorting and sifting through that much data. But basically, tricksters, fraudsters, whatever you want to call it, have found ways to kind of modify the search results so that you get incorrect phone numbers that they're in control of. And I think there was an example of like Coinbase customer service. Some malicious intended people were advertising a wrong phone number for Coinbase, and they were able to defraud one of the callers out of like $100,000. So this is becoming a little bit more rampant, and it is one of the indications that we need to do a little bit better job as the consumers of that when we're searching to trust but verify and maybe check those numbers and see if things look weird and go to the website instead of just relying on Google searches.
Yeah, I think probably Google could do a little bit more here, but it is, again, also incumbent on us as consumers to be smart about the information we're accessing.
Yeah, but you know what? There's some stuff Google can do, but there's also people can buy ads.
Right.
And there's not a lot,
Yeah.
and especially in the ecosystem. I mean, it's easy to sit here and go, okay, well, but they should know that it's like, I think one of the examples was Delta. They should know that it's Delta buying the ad or Coinbase buying the ad versus, somebody else that's a scammer. That's not handled like directly. And it's not always going to come from that email domain. Like there's marketing companies that are 3 levels of outsource doing some of those campaigns. And I think it's a harder lift than it seems at first blush.
Yeah, I'll take that. Although the cynic in me wants to be like, well, doesn't Google have AI to handle that?
Oh, snap.
Yeah.
Somebody's feisty today.
Yeah, I'm a little feisty. Links in the show notes if you want to read up on what's plaguing Google, but we'll move on. Cisco Talos researchers have uncovered vulnerabilities in popular Microsoft apps running on macOS that could allow attackers to inject malicious libraries into the Microsoft applications that would inherit the app's entitlements and rights. Talos says Microsoft has addressed this vulnerability in some apps, but that Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, and Word remain vulnerable. There's a detailed description of the exploit in the show notes. We can chat about it a little bit here.
Minor details there. Only apps like Excel, Outlook.
Yeah, only Excel, only Word.
The repercussion of that is, it said the attackers could do things like, send emails from the user's account without the user knowing, record audio clips, take photos and videos without any user interaction, which I think is a little bit creepy. And it looked like kind of digging beneath this idea that by not validating and not having signed libraries, basically some malicious libraries could be inserted into the real app that already had permissions.
Mhm.
And of course, I'm kind of thinking of Men in Black, where the alien comes and then he's in the, the big dude that drank all the sugar water and he's like crawled up inside of the human body.
Yes.
And walking around. So it's kind of like that, except for not exactly like that, obviously. But it injects into the real application, which has the library validation disabled. And so then an attacker, once they're in there, can do the same things that whatever that application has permissions to do. And therefore, the Mac is not reprompting the user to allow permissions.
Yeah. And as far as I could tell from the Talos blog, it didn't seem like there was a user-based remediation for this. It seems like it's going to have to come down to Apple and Microsoft figuring this out. It might have to do with more signing of libraries and so on, but there was a fairly complex technical reason for how this vulnerability occurred, and it's not a fix that you or I can just change a setting on our machines to take care of it.
Yeah, I'm quoting. Microsoft considers these issues low risk. And it goes on to say, that some of their applications need to have unsigned libraries to support plugins. I really liked the article that we have, Drew, that you found from Talos, because it kind of digs into that even a little bit further. Like there's code examples. So if you're into that sort of thing and you want to geek out, go for it. But I thought it was really interesting because they're kind of pushing back and saying, based on following that thread, there probably shouldn't be a reason to allow unsigned libraries. Again, not a developer, not a lawyer. I don't know how that stuff works on the back end, but with the way they explained it made sense to me. And I'm going to be on team let's sign libraries.
All right. That's a good team to be on. A couple more stories before we wrap. A Kentucky man has been sentenced to more than 6 years in prison for using stolen credentials to access Hawaii's death registry system. And the reason he did it, so he could list himself as deceased. And why? Because if he was dead, he wouldn't have to pay his child support.
Oh my gosh. This was an elaborate multi-hop hacking spree that is really amusing. And then I think what's not captured in the summaries anywhere or at least I didn't see, there's a quote. It also sounds like there was an identity theft component to it. So
yes,
he faked himself out dead. So he brute forced some passwords from like a legitimate doctor in another state, logged into, I think, a Hawaiian database, pronounced himself dead, signed the death certificate, used some other credentials stolen from somewhere else to do something else, and then also broke into some other sites and was trying to sell that access on the dark web.
Yeah, he was very busy. I guess too busy not to pay child support. It seems like with all the work he was doing, he could have had a job and just paid the money he owed to his child.
Yeah, I don't know how much the child support alone was, but I think in the article that you found, like the total number for all of the damages and the back due child support was less than 200,000. I mean, it's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money, but
it's not go to jail for the rest of your life and pretend like you're dead money.
Right. Yes, it seems like an extreme. Apparently, he's got some skills. He should be using them for good.
Yeah, use your powers for good, people. Use your powers for good.
And we'll wrap on something, JJ, you brought in at the last minute about government domains.
Yeah, I just wanted to get this PSA out, public service announcement here, because this came up and bubbled on a thread with a friend. It happened on LinkedIn, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know. I bet some of our listeners would be interested in this. And this is that all public sector, tribal, municipal, state, all of it, down to school districts attached to government and not attached to government, can get .gov domains. This spun out of a conversation around the prevalence constantly of fraudulent domain registrations. And I post these on LinkedIn sometimes, and I'm only posting the ones that I'm kind of directly involved with through one of my client partners. But basically, people will register domains, and a lot of times it's a public sector domain, like RaleighCitySchools.org.
Mm-hmm.
Or sometimes, because in the US, we've got like something.something.state.us.
Right.
So it could be like cityofraleigh.nc.us, and that might be a typical thing. However, basically, any of those TLDs, US, org, net, com, anybody can register. But to register a .gov domain in the US, you have to go through the federal government that's managed by CISA. So there's a lot of validation that happens. And so your users, your partners, your customers, the public that you're servicing has a guaranteed level of confidence when you're using a .gov domain.
Huh.
So all of, schools, municipal governments, all of you guys out there, this might be something to take internally and have the conversation. And it helps prevent, because, those of us, if everybody's moving to this, it's harder for a fraudster, a scammer to register a very similar domain, because what they're doing is they'll register a domain, they'll redirect it to the real website. So if you go look it up and somebody is just kind of checking, going, oh, okay, it really is their site, you might not realize that that's what happened. And they're scraping entire email signatures. So they're actually using, like, in this case, it's a lot of people trying to establish procurement terms. So they're scraping, somebody in purchasing, full logo, email signature, all that jazz, phone numbers and everything, and then contacting and trying to set up terms and buy stuff. So long story short, if you're in any way, shape, or form public sector, including schools, you can get a .gov domain. And that website is an HTTPS site, get.gov/domains. So get.gov/domains will get you there. Of course, that'll be in the show notes too.
Yep, for sure. And I'm glad to hear that they're actually doing some verification, because I was a little worried about this. But if they are actually verifying or making you do some steps, then hopefully they won't be misused.
Lots of steps.
That's good. All right, well, that wraps up this episode of Packet Protector. Thank you for joining us. You can find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want more nerdy goodness on networking, wireless, cloud, network automation, and more, you can go to packetpushers.net, where you'll find thousands of hours of free technical content for your listening pleasure. If you heard anything on the show and you want to send us a comment, a follow-up, a correction, whatever, you can always hit us up at packetpushers.net/FU. The FU is for follow-up, or find JJ and I on LinkedIn and Slack. As always, thanks for listening, and be safe out there.